in den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni. Auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
Operation Barbarossa had actually failed even before it was launched, because with the possibilities open to Germany's political and military leaders in 1941, in the absence of a clear strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union could never have been won.
It was the great conflict between two major ideologies of the time, fascism and communism. They clashed head-on with all the manpower and material the two sides could mobilize.
It was a war of conquest, a war of aggression in violation of international law, and a war of annihilation waged against the backdrop of National Socialist racial ideology.
People in the Soviet Union thought the Nazi regime has begun a war of annihilation, so there is no question of me ever being ready to compromise, because that compromise will cost me my life.
Right from the start, it was an operation in which criminal behavior played a central role. The unusual, indeed specific characteristic of this operation is that law and morality were totally disregarded.
There wasn't really a plan, apart from we're going to attack the Soviet Union and take Moscow, and ideally, by then we'll have won. That was so detached from reality.
They left too hastily to change the sign. Along the cold stretches of the road back, the retreating supermen left the marks of their bestiality.
At midday on August 23, 1939, a German delegation landed at Moscow airport. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had sent his personal limousine to collect Hitler's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop.
The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 was, of course, a sensation. Just imagine the two biggest ideological movements of the Bolshevism and National Socialism suddenly enter into a pact after laying into each other for years in their propaganda. In fact, that propaganda really was the worst kind of agitation. Not only from the Nazis, but also from the Soviets, through the Comintern. This rabble-rousing had been spread throughout Europe. Then, suddenly, the two were standing shoulder to shoulder.
The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact declared that neither government would ally itself to or aid an enemy of the other. In a secret protocol, it was agreed that borders in Eastern Europe would be redefined.
The Hitler-Stalin Pact came as a major surprise. Basically, though, it was an incredibly clever tactical move by both sides, because initially each had managed to isolate itself from the other, so to speak, and each now had the backing of a treaty. The decisive factor, however, was that both parties had won time. Hitler had won time to wage his war in the West, and the Soviet Union had won time to rearm. That was actually a mutual promise. The other promise was the division of Eastern Europe.
First of all, the pact smoothed the way for Hitler to invade Poland. Even before that campaign was over, Soviet troops marched into the eastern part of the country. The German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army met in Brest-Litovsk. Nazi Germany could now obtain food products and all strategically important raw materials from the Soviet Union. In May 1940, the Wehrmacht felt powerful enough to confront the Allies in the West. After only a few weeks, France was forced to seek an armistice. Hitler saw himself confirmed in his self-chosen role as a brilliant commander. The legend of the Blitzkrieg was born.
Hitler was certainly no idiot. He came from the very bottom but had battled his way to the top. And of course, in doing so, he had experienced a great deal. So he perhaps understood more than someone from a humanist grammar school background. He had been able to study people, the masses, and also socio-psychological mechanisms very closely. And what is interesting is that in doing so, he had formed an ideology which had nothing to do with reality, of course. However, he toned down this ideology somewhat and tried to use it tactically. He also made concessions to reality, and up until 1940, it had brought him great success.
On July the 6th, 1940, the dictator made a triumphant return to Berlin. He had decided that his next step would be to conquer the British Isles and then, at last, wage war on the Soviet Union. That day, Colonel General Franz Halder noted in his war journal that it is now time to seek a politico-military basis for the future work of the General Staff.
But in July 1940, Hitler himself had stated unequivocally that it was now time to act. Living space in the East and war in Eastern Europe, that was all quite clear. It had already been announced. On Hitler's orders, detailed planning really did get underway in July 1940. Various sections of the Armed Forces High Command had already begun thinking about how to approach the campaign, and so had upper echelons in the Navy. In principle, General Staffs plan within the political climate in their country, going through possible conflict constellations. And in this respect, the Third Reich was no different from other countries. Consequently, there were even considerations in the 1930s as to how a war in the East should be approached.
On July 31st, 1940, in the presence of German military leaders, Hitler announced his decision to invade the Soviet Union the following spring. By now, the authority of the commander-in-chief was sacrosanct, even for skeptical military figures. The head of the Army General Staff, Franz Halder, was to coordinate plans for the Wehrmacht. Responsibility for a detailed elaboration of the operation against the Soviet Union was given to Major General Friedrich Paulus.
Franz Halder and Friedrich Paulus were the implementing bodies of Hitler's ideological concept, or rather of his delusions. They were the ones who had to make these fantasies feasible. That was actually their crucial role. And the sad and terrible thing is that for professional military reasons, they did not understand this.
Paulus was one of the leading General Staff officers who were involved in planning this operation, which at that time had not yet been given the name Barbarossa. Many areas of the military drew up their plans independently. Army High Command was only one of them. The Navy prepared its own plans, as did the Armed Forces High Command. These plans were then put together and presented to Hitler on December the 5th, 1940.
The week before, Paulus had played through an initial plan for an attack on the Soviet Union. He wanted to convince the dictator of the need for a swift advance with armored units to prevent battle-worthy units of the Red Army withdrawing into the vast expanses behind them.
Initially, that was one of many options, and at least Germany's military elite was set on ending the war with Great Britain and its empire. So there were three issues: the war in the air against the British Isles, the war in the Atlantic, and the war in the Mediterranean, plus Barbarossa, which sort of ran alongside. After 6 months, Hitler noticed that Barbarossa was stagnating, so he stepped on the gas, so to speak, and from December 1940 on, concrete plans for the invasion were forged. Prior to that, it had merely been an option, and Hitler himself had long hesitated. That was because he had stated how proud he was that Germany, in contrast to the First World War, was not involved in a war on two fronts. "We won't make the same mistake this time," he had said. But now, with eyes wide open, he was heading into precisely the same situation.
The policy behind Hitler's Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, was clearly the destruction of the Soviet Union and the conquest of territory up to a line stretching roughly from Arkhangelsk, east of Moscow, down to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. After the Red Army had been defeated, everything else was to be pushed back behind the Urals and the space thus created made available to German settlers. That basically was Hitler's plan, and it was on this plan that Wehrmacht leaders structured operations.
An invasion of the Soviet Union seemed reckless, but the Wehrmacht saw the Soviet Union militarily as a behemoth with feet of clay that would quickly collapse after the first few reverses. The operation is only meaningful, Halder said, if we crush the state in one go. Our goal is to destroy Russia's life force.
German military leaders like to plan a battle of annihilation. Ideally, this means engaging the enemy frontally, outflanking him on one or both sides, then encircling him and thus forcing him to surrender. With the fighting power of the enemy thus eliminated, the deployment of Red Army forces on the country's western border was evaluated on the same basis, and that assessment suited German plans perfectly.
Once again, success was to be achieved with a blitzkrieg. German strategists knew that following Germany's invasion of Poland, the Soviet armed forces had rearmed extensively. By rights, they should have known that German soldiers would be facing one of the most powerful armies in the world. But they made a serious mistake. They underestimated the Red Army.
We should certainly try to imagine the situation back then. The pitiful showing by the Red Army in the Finno-Soviet Winter War played a decisive role. It led German military leaders to think that the Red Army was not an adversary to be taken seriously.
In November 1939, the Soviet Union had attacked Finland without any declaration of war. The aim was to force the country into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Red Army fought valiantly, but suffered heavy losses. Its troops had too few automatic weapons and no winter clothing, and the conflict claimed 120,000 Russian lives. Wehrmacht leaders saw this as confirmation of their assessment of the Red Army.
There were definitely military figures who had long been molded by German military doctrine, including the arrogance towards Eastern Europe. But just by looking at the map and seeing the size of the Soviet Union, they should have realized that defeating this adversary would not be easy. So basically, even in 1941, the Germans still didn't know which operational or strategic goal they had to pursue in order to win the war.
When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov visited Berlin in November 1940, relations with the Kremlin seemed to have stayed the same. Stalin thought that German-Soviet friendship was sealed in blood. But Hitler had other plans, and he knew he had the Wehrmacht General Staff behind him.
At the time, they could not see the Soviet Union as a serious military opponent. Thus, its military potential was staggeringly underestimated. In January 1941, Halder wrote in his journal, "They're still not clear about Barbarossa, but they're still going ahead with it." That, so to speak, was the military's traditional understanding of obedience. The political leadership set the strategic guidelines, and the military translated them operationally. And it is precisely what happened.
Early June 1941. Stationed in Paderborn was a Wehrmacht supply unit under the command of Lieutenant Gerd Brügelmann. The 28-year-old officer from Cologne was a keen amateur cine photographer. He took these pictures of his unit setting off for a criminal war, a war whose scope many of the troops could scarcely have imagined.
Living space in the East for Germans had already been an issue in the days of the Kaiser, so it wasn't really anything new when the German people heard Hitler saying that this living space in the East had to be secured. but the fact that he had planned this right from the start in a criminal way was a totally new dimension. At first, for those who listened to his ideas, it was probably inconceivable. Over the course of the 1930s, however, he had repeated so often how he planned to wage the war and what his actual goal was, namely not just to secure territory but to eliminate the people living there. In 1941, it was perfectly clear how this war would be waged.
The Nazis' ideological justification for their racial war was revealed by The Soviet Paradise, a propaganda film which featured in German cinemas in 1942.
Wo früher blühende Dörfer standen, herrscht heute das graue Elend der Kolchose. Hier lebt der russische Bauer als Arbeitssklave auf dem Boden, der ihm einst gehörte. Das Vieh verkommt in verfallenen Ställen. Das sind die verhängnisvollen Ergebnisse einer über 20-jährigen Blutherrschaft der jüdisch-bolschewistischen Terrorklicke.
The final battle against the Slavic race was to cost 30 million lives.
The Second World War on the Eastern Front was definitely planned as a war of annihilation. It was specially designed to decimate the Soviet population, to subjugate it, and to create living space in the East for Germans. Because the German race, the Nazis claimed, needed more living space. And this living space in Soviet Russia was regarded as highly lucrative and productive. In Nazi ideology, the Soviet people were subhuman and had no right to decide on their own life or death.
Auch das Leben der Menschen in der Stadt ist trostlos. Unmittelbar neben den kalten Prachtbauten beginnen die Wohnhäuser das Stadtbild zu beherrschen. In diesem Mietshaus am größten Platz der Stadt sind 15 Quartiere. Das heißt 15 Zimmer, in denen 80 Menschen hausen müssen. Die einzige Toilette für alle Mieter, sowie für das noch im Hause befindliche Speiserestaurant.
Gerd Brügelmann and his unit traveled by train right across Nazi Germany to East Prussia. The invasion of the Soviet Union was scheduled for June 22, 1941. The unit's task was to help secure supplies.
Vor der Reichskanzlei in den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni. Das Haus des Rundfunks. Die Übertragung der Führerproklamation über alle deutschen Sender wird vorbereitet.
Everything had been meticulously planned. The Germans were to be prepared for a new Wehrmacht campaign with a cock and bull story. The Nazis' top propagandist insisted on announcing the conspiracy theory himself.
Das Reichsministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda. Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels verliest die Proklamation des Führers. Sie enthüllt zum ersten Mal vor der ganzen Welt die Verschwörung zwischen London und Moskau gegen Deutschland. Der Führer zieht nach monatelangem Schweigen nunmehr in 12. Stunde die noch einzig mögliche Konsequenz mit den Worten: Ich habe mich entschlossen, das Schicksal und die Zukunft des Deutschen Reiches wieder in die Hand unserer Soldaten zu legen. Vom Nordkap bis zum Schwarzen Meer schützt nunmehr die deutsche Wehrmacht, zu Lande, zu Wasser und in der Luft, Seite an Seite mit Finnen und Rumänen, Europa. Italien schließt sich spontan an, ebenso die Slowakei. Auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
The Wehrmacht consisted of 153 divisions, the Red Army of 237. Operation Barbarossa could only succeed if the enemy was encircled close to the border and could be prevented from withdrawing into the vast expanses of the Russian hinterland.
Originally, the Blitzkrieg was a tactic born out of need. Since the German army lacked the resources for a lengthy war, it could do little more than overcome an enemy as quickly as possible with rapid attacks by fast units, which it possessed in astonishingly small numbers. Because of the size of the territory, it was not possible to achieve a swift victory in the Soviet Union. Yet Germany's military leaders still thought that they could end the war in 4 to 6 weeks, in 2 months at the most.
Die Spitze halt! Die Ortschaft wird von sibirischen Scharfschützen erbittert verteidigt.
Nazi propaganda showed Wehrmacht units who had crossed the border from East Prussia into the Soviet Union and been involved in combat by the Red Army.
When the blow came, it was from 5 different directions, and from the north, 1 extra, just for luck. That was the big day. As dawn broke, nearly 200 Axis divisions, more than 2 million men, plunged into a front 2,000 miles long, reaching from the White Sea to the Black. Their aim, the annihilation of the Red Army in a decisive battle on the frontier.
The German General Staff knew full well, of course, that it had to be a short war because Germany would not be able to sustain a lengthy conflict, even though Hitler, I think, was of a different opinion. He was convinced that sooner or later the fundamental superiority of the German Wehrmacht would see the war won. That is why German operational plans had always been based on the swiftest possible end to the war, and the operational target was Moscow. Whether its capture would have had a decisive impact on the conflict is open to question, but it was the source of a dispute between Hitler and members of his general staff who basically thought solely along operational lines.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des 28. Juni brechen deutsche und verbündete Truppen in einer Breite von fast 300 Kilometern durch die sowjetischen Linien. In zähen Angriff wurden die feindlichen Stellungen, zu deren Ausbau die Bolschewisten den ganzen Winter über Zeit gehabt hatten, aufgerissen und aufgerollt.
In his war journal, the head of the General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote, "It seems like the enemy has been tactically surprised all round."
Die Angriffsoperationen finden in einem weiträumigen, welligen Kampfgelände statt, das oft von schwer zugänglichen Wäldern durchsetzt ist. Die erbitterten Gegenangriffe werden mit schweren Verlusten für den Feind abgeschlagen.
The invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 was a clash between 2 great armies who had been trained quite differently and, above all, whose level of field experience was also quite different. Over almost 2 years, and this, I believe, is the decisive point, the Wehrmacht had fought one campaign after another in the shortest possible time, and it had also gone through a rearmament phase, in which it had been systematically modernized.
Artillerie nimmt die ersten Bunker der Stalinlinie, die als Bauernhöfe getarnt sind, unter Feuer.
The old Soviet border had been fortified with bunker installations. For days, the Red Army had prevented the Wehrmacht from breaking through, so German losses were high. But Nazi propaganda never mentioned this.
Mit der Infanterie und den Pionieren gehen Panzer vor. Die Granaten der feindlichen Artillerie schlagen zwischen den vorgehenden Verbänden ein.
On the one hand, it was a huge army, but on the other, it lacked qualified leaders. In the Red Army, the Wehrmacht experience of modern warfare was largely non-existent. That's the one factor. The other is that the Red Army had stationed all its troops along the western border. Soviet military doctrine stated that in the event of war, actual hostilities should take place on neighboring terrain, so that basically Soviet territory would not suffer from the fighting. But this, of course, presented the Wehrmacht with ideal conditions, which, with its armoured wedges, supported by Stukas, was able to penetrate.
Das sind natürlich ideale Voraussetzungen.
In reality, what was stylized in Nazi newsreels in the name of Hitler looked quite different. Gerd Brügelmann had his 16mm camera with him and filmed the German advance on Russian roads. As his family's sole surviving son, he was allowed to remain at a safe distance from the front. His supply unit had trouble keeping pace with the rapid advance of Army Group Center. So there was only ever a short time for break before his unit moved deeper into the Ukraine.
There was no way of preparing everything that occurred inside the Russian border. If you like, and if you want to express it cynically, the annihilation concept, which Hitler had propagated right from the start, suited Germany's military leaders perfectly. It meant the Wehrmacht could feed off the land. It did not have to concern itself with the civilian population. The troops could take whatever they needed.
Quite a few inhabitants of the Ukraine were far from unhappy about the defeat of communism, which, in the years after the October Revolution, had seen millions die of hunger or murdered in cold blood. But the Germans didn't behave as liberators. Instead, they robbed the inhabitants of the towns and villages of the basis of their existence. Gerd Brügelmann's unit was no exception. Its task was to supply the 9th Armored Division with spare parts and food.
Obviously, the armored units were particularly suitable for rapid movement, so they were important for encircling operations, which at the start of the campaign were successful. However, I feel that the image created by the armored units paints a totally inaccurate picture of the Wehrmacht. Because if we look at the Wehrmacht in 1941, it was largely a mounted army. It had around 600,000 vehicles of all kinds, but it also had exactly the same number of horses, which were used especially in combat territory. The artillery needed them to pull its guns. So, as far as the majority of its units were concerned, the Wehrmacht was essentially a mounted army.
Gerd Brügelmann's unit is seen taking a rest near Nevel, a town in Oblast Pskov with a long tradition. On July 15, 1941, only 3 weeks after the start of the campaign, it was occupied by the troops of Army Group Center. The men headed east on dusty roads that were rarely paved. When the conditions proved too much for a Wehrmacht truck, the villagers had to help get it back on the road. Such scenes were a portent of what lay only a few months ahead for the Germans. As yet, though, Hitler's military machine was still rolling forwards. The Barbarossa plan foresaw an armored thrust towards Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev. At the same time, the main forces of the Red Army were to be destroyed through the encirclement of vast areas.
The reason why at the beginning of the war the Wehrmacht had so much success with major encirclement battles was because its troops knew exactly what they had to do. That's because fighting a battle of annihilation corresponded to the old German military doctrine of first engaging the enemy frontally, then outflanking and encircling him. And the Wehrmacht was well equipped for this. It had fast units headed by tanks, which performed these flanking and encircling movements. The mass body of troops who were either on foot or mounted then moved up to complete the ring.
Hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops were captured in this way. These pictures were taken after the fall of Kiev by an unknown amateur cine film enthusiast advancing with the 6th Armored Regiment.
In my opinion, there are basically three reasons why the Germans took so many prisoners in the first months of the war. Firstly, with their shock troop tactic, the Germans were able to advance at specific points, outflank the enemy left and right, and create an encirclement area containing enormous numbers of enemy soldiers. Secondly, the Soviet forces were poorly led by young commanders who had only been trained in the 1930s, had no frontline experience, and at times had no idea what was going on. They simply had to learn from the situation they were in. A third reason is the rigid tactics of the Soviet forces. The order would come to stand firm at the front, and the Red Army's standardized officers didn't dare to retreat. However, as a response to the actions of the Germans, from a tactical point of view, this was probably expedient.
8 years of Nazi propaganda were taking effect. Most German soldiers saw their prisoners not as equal adversaries, but as low-life scum who did not deserve to be treated respectfully in accordance with the Hague Convention. Any German soldier who showed sympathy was ridiculed by his colleagues.
Soviet soldiers were captured through encirclement operations or directly at the front. As soon as a German unit had taken enough prisoners, they were moved back into the hinterland under guard. Sometimes this involved forced marches of several hundred kilometers, and a large number of Soviet prisoners of war died along the way. Soviet citizens who talk about these POW marches often say that when the Germans and their captives had passed by, hundreds of prisoners would be left lying by the roadside. That is a striking image. And those prisoners who arrived on some plane or other were not even being fenced in because they had no strength left to flee. They also were left to the caprices of the weather because the real aim was for them to die.
Cameramen with the Nazi propaganda machine took footage like this to show cinema-goers in Germany what Judeo-Bolshevik subhumans looked like.
The way Soviet prisoners of war were dealt with was a crime right from the start, not only because the orders to the troops had made it clear that the Soviet POW was to be treated not as a soldier but as a subhuman. The entire litany of National Socialist racial ideology came into effect, passed on to the troops not from some Nazi party office, but from the Wehrmacht leadership, from the head of the Armed Forces High Command, Field Marshal Keitel himself. And High Command had not made any provisions for feeding Soviet prisoners of war. It was simply assumed that they would die.
The plan really was to decimate the Soviet forces and take as few prisoners of war as possible, because they would also have to be fed and looked after. That was never even a consideration where Soviet POWs were concerned. The picture we often see of a huge mass of desolate Soviet prisoners on an open field, grabbing at the bits of bread that were being thrown to them, really was something that frequently took place in the first months of the war, because that's precisely what had been planned beforehand.
But the reality, of course, was never shown.
What was so perfidious, however, was that Soviet prisoners had to dig a hollow in the earth with their bare hands to try and get a bit of protection from the weather. German soldiers just stood there seeing confirmation of the image they had of a subhuman, someone who digs a hole for himself in the ground. It was disgraceful not only that they reduced prisoners to such a state in the first place, but also that they then saw their image of the Soviet soldier confirmed.
Those who survived the horror of the death marches were sent to Germany and interned. In August 1941, Propaganda Minister Goebbels visited a prisoner of war camp near Riesa to take a personal look at the subhumans. As early as May 13th, 1941, Hitler had stipulated through the High Command of the Armed Forces that crimes committed by civilians against the German Wehrmacht were not to be dealt with in due process by a military court.
Right from the start, the martial law decree, like the Commissar order, was not only something criminal, it was also the deliberate rejection of all the conventions which up to then had been observed in all wars in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And the fact that the Wehrmacht not only allowed itself to be used as a tool, but to a certain extent was also the initiator of these decrees, shows how it thought. It was all about the army having a free hand in the East and not being bound by any conventions that would have to be respected anywhere else in the world.
German soldiers guilty of any wrongdoing would not have to expect being called to account by a military court.
The Barbarossa martial law decree was a huge carte blanche for the Wehrmacht, and of course it was a political order, and it overrode classic martial law. The decree was drawn up firstly with the troops in mind. If they had committed a crime, they no longer had to justify their actions. On the other hand, there were also Soviet civilians, for whom the Wehrmacht would now assume responsibility for determining justice in the classic sense. This was of major importance, especially where partisans and such like were concerned. And these decisions could be taken by any officer. Such stipulations were criminal right from the start, because every war tends towards radicalization.
In particular, partisans in civilian clothing who were fighting the Germans from the forests were thus fair game. On July 27, 1941, a German soldier wrote, "The Russians are tough adversaries. Now we take hardly any of them prisoner. Instead, we shoot them all." This brutality also had an effect on the civilian population of the Ukraine, which at first had been glad to see the Wehrmacht so victorious.
Some of the Soviet population, at least in the western parts of the country, had even welcomed German troops as liberators from Stalinist terror. Most, however, had adopted a neutral stance and tried simply to survive the war. They were neither particularly friendly nor particularly hostile. However, the behavior of the German troops generated growing resistance. This was relatively understandable. These foreign soldiers turn up, destroy my home and deprive me of my livelihood. So obviously, I have to take a stand.
As the Wehrmacht advanced, it left behind a trail of destruction, with scant regard for the losses suffered by the civilian population. In the occupied areas, the Germans established a reign of terror. The Wehrmacht made no concessions and systematically suppressed the local inhabitants.
The martial law decree stipulated that any crimes committed by the Germans or their allies would not be prosecuted. It created a state of lawlessness. Soldiers could do what they wanted. The Commissar order decreed that any political commissar with the Red Army who fell into German hands had to be shot. Both orders were a license to commit murder.
Beides sind Mordbefehle.
Sowjetsoldaten, die sich Zivilkleider anzogen, ihrer Gefangennahme zu entgehen. Die politischen Truppenkommissare hatten ihnen eingeredet, dass die Deutschen die Gefangenen zu Tode marterten.
As early as June 6, 1941, the Wehrmacht leadership ordered that political commissars with the Red Army were not to be treated as prisoners of war.
Zwei weibliche Kommissare. Sie gehörten zu den Henkersknechten der GPU.
As organs of the enemy's forces, political commissars can be recognized by the special badge on their sleeves. It shows a red star with a hammer and sickle in gold. These commissars are not to be regarded as soldiers. The protection which prisoners of war enjoy under international law doesn't apply. They are to be segregated and executed.
The Commissar order was a direct license to kill, whether or not that person had already surrendered. In other words, martial law was suspended. Since no one had the chance to defend themselves, it was a concrete inducement to commit murder. In all the confusion of war, it is sometimes difficult to make a distinction. So often there were also situations in which a non-commissar was killed in the heat of the moment. In such cases, it was then claimed that it was a commissar, that the badge with the red star denoting a commissar had simply been torn off. With that assertion, the person who had committed the murder could walk away with impunity.
Some troop leaders were less than happy with the Commissar order. They felt that it gave the enemy greater motivation to fight. If political commissars knew that if captured they faced death, they would of course have no interest in surrendering, but would fight on, if necessary, to the death, a fate which might possibly await them anyway. It was a similar case with the martial law decree. Troop leaders believed it provoked resistance among the local population in the first place. But we have to make a distinction, because large numbers even of this military elite had no problem at all when communists or Jews were involved.
After the Wehrmacht had taken Liepāja in Latvia, Red Army soldiers and communists were shot along with the town's 7,000 or so Jewish inhabitants. By chance, in the summer of 1941, Marine Richard Wiener filmed this footage of a mass execution by an SS death squad. On August 15th, Heinrich Himmler personally attended an execution near Minsk. It's said that at the sight of the bloodbath, the head of the SS turned as white as a sheet. Afterwards, he said that while mass shootings were revolting, they were still a necessary defensive measure.
The advancing Wehrmacht units created the space for crimes behind the front. In general, cooperation between the leadership of the Wehrmacht, the various operational headquarters, and the death squads went smoothly. To a certain extent, the death squads were accepted in order to avoid security units needing to be stationed behind the front. That job, pacifying these areas, as it was called, could be left to the death squads. In other words, they could butcher and destroy and leave other German units free for battle. On the other hand, sometimes, of course, ordinary soldiers were involved in these crimes and also committed crimes of their own. So the idea of an unsullied Wehrmacht is a post-war myth that has been propagated in Germany for decades. At no time was the Wehrmacht ever unsullied.
Many German soldiers were beginning to feel oppressed by the vast size of the Soviet Union and its seemingly endless expanses. The Red Army was fighting the German military machine with a courage born of desperation, and the Wehrmacht was suffering severe losses.
The German concept was based on a blitzkrieg strategy whereby fast, motorized armored units would break through enemy lines at speed and use this advantage ruthlessly, even with regard to the Wehrmacht's own troops, and then bring up other units to complete the encirclement and destroy the enemy or force it to capitulate. This was not only a tour de force, it was, of course, also an approach that was particularly aggressive and perhaps especially masculine. But it did not spare human life, not even the lives of the Wehrmacht's own troops. This explains why German losses in men and material were so high.
By mid-August, the three army groups had lost more than 200,000 men. The 6th Armored Regiment also suffered huge losses. The Nazi leadership saw this as no reason to tone down the euphoria of victory.
Germany's military leaders were so impressed by these initial successes that, after 2 weeks, Halder noted in his war journal that no war has ever been won as quickly as this one. This, I think, shows that the highest German command structures had totally underestimated the situation. No matter how many prisoners were taken, how many tanks and guns were destroyed, they simply did not expect the Red Army to reorganize time and time again. The fact that Hitler repeatedly intervened in these scenarios and that to a certain extent, at least where operations were concerned, Wehrmacht leaders were of a totally different opinion shows quite clearly that the German leadership had absolutely no idea what the strategic goal of the war was supposed to be.
When Hitler paid a visit to his troops in the Ukraine in late August 1941, it was already dawning on Chief of General Staff Franz Halder that taking Moscow would be no easy task. Feeling slightly resigned to the situation, he noted, "If we destroy a dozen divisions, the Russians will simply assemble a dozen more."
The story of the Second World War is, of course, also the story of Hitler's emancipation process as a quote-unquote great commander, a role he assumed for himself. Naturally, he did have a certain amount of military experience, but on the other hand, unlike all the officers on his general staff, he had never had any systematic training. And, not to be too blunt about it, he was not prepared to think logically, but only within his ideological framework. It must be admitted, however, that he was a great dominator of people, and he also managed to assert his dominance in these smaller meetings in a literally uncanny way.
The German troops still cheered their commander-in-chief, and in private the dictator still boasted that, by and large, the war in the East has already been won. Moscow will be razed to the ground. But appearances were deceptive.
The first crisis in Germany's conduct of the war was already noticeable in August 1941. Despite the great encirclement battles and enormous losses in men and material the Red Army was suffering, Wehrmacht leaders realized that this campaign was going to be different from the one they had planned. So even in August, basically the Blitzkrieg was no longer an issue. The goal now was to take Moscow in order to end the war in victory.
Vor uns Mogilev. Von einem Kornfeld gedeckt geht es vorwärts. Der Weg in die Stadt ist freigekämpft. Allein bei diesen Kämpfen wurden über 35.000 Gefangene gemacht. Sowjetischer Rückzug bedeutet völlige Zerstörung. Auch Mogilev ist zum größten Teil vernichtet.
From Mogilev, it was still another 600 kilometers to Moscow, and the rainy Russian autumn was approaching.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni, auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern, vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
Operation Barbarossa had actually failed even before it was launched, because, with the possibilities open to Germany's political and military leaders in 1941, in the absence of a clear strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union could never have been won.
It was the great conflict between two major ideologies of the time, fascism and communism. They clashed head-on with all the manpower and material the two sides could mobilize.
It was a war of conquest, a war of aggression in violation of international law, and a war of annihilation waged against the backdrop of National Socialist racial ideology.
People in the Soviet Union thought, the Nazi regime has begun a war of annihilation, so there is no question of me ever being ready to compromise, because that compromise will cost me my life.
Right from the start, it was an operation in which criminal behavior played a central role. The unusual, indeed specific characteristic of this operation is that law and morality were totally disregarded.
There wasn't really a plan, apart from, we're going to attack the Soviet Union and take Moscow, and ideally, by then we'll have won. That was so detached from reality.
They left too hastily to change the sign. Along the cold stretches of the road back, the retreating supermen left the marks of their bestiality.
June 23, 1941. Headlines in the Soviet Union were dominated by the news that Germany had invaded. In Moscow, people patiently stood in line to buy the party newspaper. Although its citizens were surprised by the outbreak of war, there was no visible sign of panic.
23 июня. В «Правде» напечатано выступление товарища Молотова по радио. Зазнавшийся Гитлер и вся его кровавая клика убедятся на деле, как сплочена и едина 200-миллионная страна.
That statement by the Soviet foreign minister was the only comment from the government. Stalin himself remained silent.
In December 1940, Soviet intelligence reported that a German invasion was to be expected. This information was passed on to Stalin. He was urged to strengthen his forces on the western border to repel any such assault. But the focus then shifted from a major counterattack to counterattacks on a more local level. This explains why so many Soviet units were pushed forward to the border. And when news was received that the Germans had amassed forces on the other side of the border, troops in a central role also advanced a little further to repel any attack. In doing so, the Soviets played into the Germans' hands because with their breakthroughs and their encirclement maneuvers, they were able to surround vast numbers of enemy troops. This was something the Russians hadn't expected. They thought they would be able to fend off any German attacks.
Stalin gave no credence to the warnings from his intelligence services. He just couldn't believe that Hitler would be so stupid as to wage a war on two fronts. Stalin was convinced that a dictator should only start wars he could win. To secure his hold on power, since 1937, Stalin had had around 1.5 million people arrested. They were either shot or disappeared into the labor camps of the Gulag. Virtually the entire leadership of the Red Army had also fallen victim to the Great Terror. Now, around 3 million soldiers only listened to orders from their Vожdь, their Führer, Joseph Stalin.
Basically, when you compare these two adversaries, a few statistics suffice to show what the Germans took on in the summer of 1941. Germany had a population of 90 million, while the Soviet Union had 190 million inhabitants. The Soviets were proud of the fact that their country covered around 1/7 of the Earth's surface. Germany had an area of 500,000 square kilometers. Those are quite some dimensions. The Russians weren't quite so professional when operating outside their borders, but when it was a case of defending the motherland, we can assume that they mobilized all existing resources. In and after 1941, that was also the case.
The problem was, all that counted in the Red Army was loyalty to the party line and unconditional obedience.
On the one hand, the Red Army had a relatively rigid command schema. You had your orders where you stood, and that's where you fought. What is more, many commanders had fallen victim to the Great Terror of the late 30s, and the next generation had little or no experience. When the Germans made their breaches, Soviet troops did not retreat, which would have been the logical response, because the command structure prevented Soviet officers from thinking independently. Naturally, they were also intimidated. So, without orders from the rear, they failed to retreat. This enabled the Germans to mount and close pincer movements, trapping vast numbers of Soviet troops.
In the months prior to the German invasion, Stalin had insisted on his troops advancing beyond the heavily defended Stalin Line to establish positions on Russia's new western border. But by June 21st, these positions were only half finished.
The German leadership had a low opinion of the Soviet military. Its officers were thought incapable of stopping the Wehrmacht. And in the first few months of the war, that really was the case. What was underestimated, however, was the toughness of the Russian soldier and the skill of the Soviet leadership at improvisation, in assembling new and effective units time and again.
Stalin avoided the general public for nearly 2 weeks. His successors claimed later that the dictator was a broken man and had hidden away outside Moscow. But in reality, he traveled every day from his dacha to his study in the Kremlin to organize resistance and talks with high-ranking officers. Finally, on July the 3rd, Stalin turned to his people.
И возможность подготовки своих сил для отпора, если фашистская Германия рискнула бы напасть на нашу страну вопреки пакту. Это определенный выигрыш для нас и проигрыш для фашистской Германии.
Soviet cinemas showed scenes designed to underline the heroic resistance of the Red Army. In reality, however, the Soviet Air Force in particular was vastly inferior. Very few of its fighters or bombers even managed to get off the ground to engage the invader. Consequently, German armor broke through Soviet defensive lines with ease.
Red Army leaders were actually under double pressure. There was the military foe, the German aggressors and their allies, but then there was also Stalin. He had taken drastic measures in response to defeat in the early days of the war. Army commanders were sacked, arrested and shot. Consequently, the lives of Soviet military commanders were also at risk from within their own ranks.
With a courage born of desperation, Red Army units fought the enemy and inflicted heavy losses. If needed, Soviet propaganda also lent a hand. Leaflets were dropped, calling on working-class soldiers, in particular, to change sides. German soldiers, go through the front line with this pass. All those who come over to the Red Army will be treated well and guaranteed a safe return home at the end of the war. Come to us. Save your lives. Very few took up the offer, and so Army Group North continued its advance on Leningrad.
Auf der Straße nach Leningrad. Schloss Krasnogvardeisk, die frühere Sommerresidenz der Zaren. Die Schlosskirche, sie wurde von den Sowjets als Bunker ausgebaut. Von allen Seiten rücken die deutschen Kolonnen gegen Leningrad vor. Der stählerne Ring um die Stadt wird immer enger gezogen.
Certain cities were also of symbolic importance to the Nazi regime. They were the cities of Bolshevism, and they had to disappear. Wehrmacht generals saw them as more of a military issue, but when we look at memoranda from Heydrich and others from early 1941 and statements by Hitler himself, it is clear what was intended: the complete elimination of Bolshevism. Time and again the attempt was made to achieve this with Leningrad. That proved unsuccessful. But in the final analysis, the total number of deaths can be attributed to this rigor and the resolute intention to capture the city and totally destroy it.
In mid-August, the Red Army succeeded in repelling the assault on Leningrad. On September the 8th, 1941, a second Wehrmacht attack was launched with massive air support. Leningrad, with its 3 million inhabitants, was almost completely cut off from the outside world.
First of all, there was this ring of steel, which, apart from a small gap, virtually encircled the city. That was the classic military situation. But there was also another strategy designed to destroy the civilian population. The Germans shelled grain and flour warehouses. They bombarded anything that could in any way be used to feed the city. They attacked anything that might support life, and they spurred one another on by referring time and again to the city's Bolshevist past and using this as an excuse for its total destruction.
For weeks, Hitler and his military leaders assumed that the fall of Leningrad would be merely a matter of time. But in the beleaguered city, all possible forces were mobilized to defend it. What Soviet propaganda didn't show were the queues outside banks and stores. People wanted to secure their savings and a food supply in case the German invaders were not repulsed. With the approval of his generals, in early October, Hitler changed his plans and ordered Army Group North to head straight for Moscow.
Not having to take Leningrad saved troops, of course. Capturing any town involves casualties, and Leningrad was prepared for defense. Its population knew that they would have to fight. Then came the advance on Moscow. Not having to take Leningrad released troops for that operation. And besides, since there had never been any intention to keep large sections of the Soviet population alive, the military probably thought that by leaving the surrounded city to its own devices, people would simply starve to death anyway.
Hitler thought economically and ideologically. So, after Leningrad, he wanted to head for the south of Russia, with its industrial regions. But his military leaders thought along classic military political lines. They wanted to make a beeline for Moscow, and Smolensk would be a great victory along the way, so to speak. After the capture of Smolensk, everything was concentrated in the center, which resulted in a major dispute amongst Germany's military leaders. Do we push on centrally to Moscow, in the middle of the country, a city which plays a totally predominant role, or do we focus on the flanks?
In erbitterten Straßenkämpfen dringen unsere Truppen am 16. Juli in die Stadt ein. 2 Wochen lang behauptete die sowjetische und britische Lügenpropaganda, Smolensk befinde sich noch in bolschewistischer Hand.
Up until September the 8th, 1941, Smolensk in western Russia was the scene of fierce fighting. The Red Army forced the Wehrmacht to engage in bitter house-to-house combat. Smolensk became the symbol of disputes between Hitler and his generals.
After the fall of Smolensk in the late summer of 1941, there was already a rigid front in the central region. Troops were often reminded of conditions in the First World War, with trenches and devastating artillery barrages. Any real activity took place on the flanks. But in autumn 1941, the generals realized that this change of focus was not effective. So everything was again concentrated on the center. And in October, what was expected to be the final assault on Moscow began. But if we reduce everything to separate operations, it was clear from the starting position that the war could not be won.
For 2 months, Operation Barbarossa was characterized by German euphoria as one battle after another was won. The Red Army suffered horrendous losses, but hundreds of thousands of German troops were also killed. This amateur footage, which Gerd Brügelmann took after a battle, is an uncensored documentation of the horrors.
Nach der Einnahme von Kiew. Auf dem jenseitigen Ufer des Dnieper die Zitadelle der Stadt.
After the biggest encirclement battle in military history, on September the 26th, 1941, the capital of the Ukraine also fell into German hands.
Deutsche Truppen rücken in Kiew ein.
Nearly 700,000 Red Army troops were trapped in Kiev. The German Luftwaffe had systematically reduced the city to rubble.
Kiev had been fiercely defended and the Germans had suffered heavy losses in capturing it. This showed how costly fighting for towns was, especially big cities. Amongst other things, it led to the decision just to lay siege to Leningrad and not to try to take it militarily, to shell and bomb it, but not capture it in a direct ground assault.
While Wehrmacht officers were enjoying the sight of Kiev in flames, SS Death Squad 6, together with the 6th Army, was planning to eliminate those sections of the populace who didn't sympathize with the invaders. The operation was disguised as a reprisal for partisan attacks. According to Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, the Wehrmacht welcomes measures and calls for a radical approach.
Babi Yar is a ravine on the edge of Kiev, where Jews from the city and surrounding area were taken and murdered with the active participation of Wehrmacht troops. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed, and the German army played an active role, not only in the massacre itself, but also in covering it up.
Babi Yar is a good example of a massacre taking place with the tolerance of the Wehrmacht. To a certain extent, the SS death squads which carried out the killings benefited from the Wehrmacht's infrastructure. Vehicles were made available. Wehrmacht units sealed off the Babi Yar ravine and in the end bulldozed the site. Wehrmacht sappers collapsed the sides of the ravine and in doing so possibly killed people who might still have been alive. So, while the massacre itself was perpetrated by the SS death squads, the Wehrmacht was either present or provided assistance.
After the war in Kiev in 1946, 15 Germans were charged with war crimes. It was a show trial. The outcome had already been decided. Nevertheless, thanks to statements by those involved, more and more details came to light. Hans Isenmann from the SS Viking Division had this to say about the events of the 29th and 30th of September 1941.
In einer Richtung zwischen zwei Reihen von aufgestellten Polizisten wurden die Leute vorgetrieben zu den Löchern, wo die Erschießung vollzogen wurde. Während dieser Treibung mussten die sich ausziehen. Bei den Gruben stand ein Spezialkommando bestehend aus SD-Männern und aus Männern gewählt aus dem Polizeibataillon 320, die Erschießung mittels Genickschuss durchführten. Die Erschießenden waren meistenteils besoffen. Die Leute baten uns, ihnen das Leben zu erschenken. Wie viel wurde alles in allem erschossen? Bis zu 25.000.
In 1941, Wilhelm Hellerford headed a section of the intelligence service.
Dort wurden dann an diesen Gräben die Erschießungen durchgeführt.
Wie viele Leute haben Sie persönlich in diese 2 Tage erschossen?
Annähernd bis 120 Personen.
Примерно до 120 человек.
Together with 10 other accused, including 2 generals, Isenmann and Hellerford were sentenced to death and hanged in Kiev at the end of January 1946.
In der südlichen Ukraine. Italienische Verbände greifen ein von den Sowjets hartnäckig verteidigtes Dorf an.
Nazi newsreels continued to carry reports of victories at the front, less and less often, however, than from the main combat areas. After the fall of Kiev, the port of Odessa and the Crimean Peninsula were strategically important objectives for army groups south. But now these operations merely flanked the advance on Moscow.
Die Bolschewiken kommen aus ihren Widerstandsnestern heraus. Gefangene werden verhört.
In early October 1941, Gerd Brügelmann's supply unit also reached Smolensk. This keen amateur cine photographer still had rolls of unexposed film with him and continued to document the Wehrmacht's allegedly unstoppable advance.
In July and August 1941, there was a phase when the British and American general staffs thought the Soviet Union might lose the war. Such was the speed of the Wehrmacht's advance that even military professionals abroad reckoned the Red Army could never hold out. This was a time when the whole of Europe suddenly thought, okay, so the Germans are going to succeed again.
Thanks to the Lease-Land Act, as it was known, the neutral United States made economic and military aid available to those countries fighting against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. In September 1941, a delegation traveled from Washington to Moscow to provide Stalin with generous help in the form of arms, raw materials and food. When the agreement was signed, a Soviet People's Commissar is said to have leaped up from his chair and exclaimed, "Now we'll win the war." The supplies were urgently needed because on October 20th, 1941, the Sixth Army reached Kharkov in the eastern Ukraine and captured the city within 5 days. The path to the Donbas coal mining region lay open, but victory over the Red Army was still a long way off.
The brutality shown by the Germans on their push for Moscow, but also in other regions in both the north and south of the country, was in every respect the basis for the resistance shown by the Soviet people. Despite all their reservations about the Bolshevist system, or indeed their opposition to it, they moved closer together. This was the old reflex which was already manifest in the war against Napoleon. Whenever an invader had to be driven out of Russia, people stood shoulder to shoulder.
Moscow was preparing for a siege. Some 300,000 volunteers worked on building fortifications around the capital. Tank traps and barricades were also put in place in the city center. The Kremlin made provisions for the government to be taken to safety. The mummified body of Lenin, the country's gold reserves, and the Tsarist treasure had already been taken to Siberia in strict secrecy. The rainy season had come early, and Gerd Brügelmann's unit often had great difficulty organizing supplies, an insurmountable problem in every section of the front.
The need for logistical support had been fully underestimated. When the campaign began, it was thought, and here the word hubris comes to mind, that resistance would collapse in the first week and the Urals could be reached within 25 days. In my opinion, no one ever considered what logical dimensions this would involve.
Welche Dimensionen das in der nachfolgenden Logistik gehabt hat.
There was no plan B.
Meines Erachtens überhaupt nicht bedacht.
What steps would be taken if the original plan didn't work?
Wo dieser ursprüngliche Plan nicht funktioniert.
Within a few days, the unpaved roads and the vast expanses of Russia were just mud tracks. In many places, the supply routes for convoys were impassable.
German military leaders had always more or less looked down on logistics. In German military thinking, operational warfare had traditionally played the decisive role. How do I win battles with the troops available to me? How supplies would arrive, what equipment the men had, played a role at best in assessing the situation. And in the war against the Soviet Union, it was no different. To some extent, it was a case of living from hand to mouth. The troops could at least live off the land. That was, after all, a war of annihilation, and the technology would arrive somehow or other. The Wehrmacht was in no way prepared for such a long war.
Only fully tracked vehicles still had a certain mobility. Heavy equipment could only be transported by rail.
There were several areas where the Germans made mistakes right from the start, like the railways, which were to play an increasingly important role in the war. Russian broad-gauge track first had to be reduced to German normal-gauge track. The second mistake was to rely far too much on trucks, which are not cross-country vehicles and soon break down.
Sappers had been working on converting Russian rail track right from the start, but progress was far too slow. Rapid sweeping operations, the actual strength of the German war machine, were no longer possible.
During the war, the Wehrmacht's spearheads became blunt very quickly. Not only in the winter of 41-42, but actually in the summer and autumn of 1941. The problem was not only the shortage of spare parts for the Germans' vehicles, but also the fact that by now the Wehrmacht also had a large range of captured vehicles at its disposal. So various people were sent back to Germany to organize certain spare parts. Naturally, this too proved to be unparalleled dilettantism. Another problem was not just the cold or the mud, but also the dust, which exposed all the Wehrmacht's materiel to incredible wear and tear.
We were always on time, Gerd Brügelmann proudly pointed out when showing his films after the war. He returned to Paderborn in November 1941. The lieutenant's unit had been completely wiped out in the major attack on Moscow. The Soviet capital was prepared for a siege. The German advance was to be stopped by 6 armies.
The Soviet Union also had virtually inexhaustible manpower potential, which enabled it to form units time and again, and these units were supplied with material and vast quantities of ammunition. That was all something the Wehrmacht no longer had at its disposal. In the first encirclement battles, everything had gone well. The motivation was also there. But leading up to Moscow, this weapon, consisting of fast-moving units breaking through in support of flanking operations, had become blunt. And basically, after Moscow, it was not in a position to do anything other than defend.
Moscow had been conquered once before by enemy troops from Western Europe. In 1812, Napoleon had led his troops through Russia, but the French campaign had ended in bitter defeat.
Anyone studying Russian history and going back as far as 1812 will notice that, including the war from 1914 to 1917, the Russians were never willing to give up. There was this inbred feeling that the motherland had to be defended at all costs. Patriotism has a long tradition that is part of their lives, and in 1941 the situation was no different.
Declaring a state of siege was intended to make it easier for our troops at the front to defend Moscow. Citizens, stay calm and show the soldiers and defenders of the capital that you are worthy. Such exhortations were designed to stop citizens panicking in fear of a hunger blockade. German commanders still believed that, basically, the Soviet Union was defeated and that it would only take one more decisive battle of annihilation.
Its expanses and climate have always been Russia's traditional allies. It was the sheer size of the country that was Napoleon's downfall. At first, the Wehrmacht quite naturally thought, we've got motorized vehicles, we've got aircraft, we've got all we need for modern warfare. But if we take a very close look at the Wehrmacht, we see that it advanced in exactly the same way as Napoleon's army, on foot or with draft horses. And accordingly, the same thing happened. The army, which was always the front line, was like a big funnel. This funnel got wider and wider, and basically the army was gradually swallowed up by this vast country.
By the time the Wehrmacht reached Moscow, its victories had taken a heavy toll. Its units were not equipped, nor were its plans designed for more than 6 months of war, and especially against a Red Army which, despite its losses, offered stubborn defense. The losses the Wehrmacht had suffered in men and material were so high that by December nothing more was possible. The penetrating power was lacking. Not that most of the tanks had been destroyed by the Red Army. Armour was available, but because of wear and tear and a shortage of spare parts, it couldn't be serviced or repaired. So it was no longer operational.
The armaments industry in Nazi Germany couldn't meet the output required by the Wehrmacht. Propaganda footage like this from the Krupp works in Essen was designed to suggest that the country's manufacturing processes made mass production possible, but that stage was still a long way off.
Turmgeschützmontage.
First, it must be said that the German economy was not really turned into a war economy until 1941, which explains why Wehrmacht units had supply problems relatively quickly. And these problems increased the longer the war lasted. What is more, a war is also a competition between the latest armament technologies. The longer a war lasts, the more new weapons are introduced. You react to what your enemy is doing, and vice versa. The introduction of the Russian T-34 tank was decisive, but not necessarily because of its quality. That was quite impressive, but other tanks were better. What made the difference was the speed with which the T-34 could be built and supplied to the front.
In the second half of 1941, the Soviet armaments industry supplied nearly 5,000 tanks of different kinds, and in 1942 the figure was 5 times as many.
It must have been clear to experts that the war could no longer be won, definitely not in the way that had been planned. At this crucial time, there must have been 1 or 2 military figures who said, "We need to pull back, or do this or that differently." But Hitler prevailed and said, "We will defend every meter as well as we can, or for as long as we can." In the end, however, the Wehrmacht had to fall back a little. It had no other choice, because if it hadn't, there was a risk of the Soviets breaching the German lines.
On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched its counter-offensive. The Wehrmacht was forced on to the defensive. 3 days later, a German soldier wrote in his diary, "Are we going to have to do a bunk? If so, may God help us." And Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, noted, "To effect redeployment, manpower will have to be provided with all possible means."
On the one hand, the vast expanses and the weather made that impossible. And on the other, the enemy had of course learnt at this point in time, with Moscow almost within reach, the Wehrmacht was totally exhausted. Some of its units had been totally depleted. The Wehrmacht had suffered around 800,000 casualties, dead, missing and wounded. That was a quarter of its entire force. Because of the geographical situation, lines were overstretched. So, the logistical planning proved worthless, and there was no winter clothing available as protection from the bitter cold.
Und es war keine Winterbekleidung für die erheblichen klimatischen Bedingungen vorhanden.
Looking back at 1941, it must be said that winter came exceptionally early, with temperatures as much as 40 below.
Früh einsetzte und wir Temperaturen hatten von unter 40 Grad unter Null.
In Berlin, the bad news from Russia came at an inauspicious time. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan was now at war with the United States. Only a few days later, Hitler positioned himself alongside his Japanese ally. As for the situation on the Eastern Front, the Führer was certain that ultimately an unbending will would prevail.
When things started to go wrong, the generals spoke up more. "Perhaps we need to change this or that after all, or pull back a little," they said. Hitler's response was, "There will be no retreat." During the further course of the war, this resistance intensified. But there was also what I would call a kind of subconscious agreement with regard to action. So, in the final analysis, it is hard to say who had the upper hand, in what way, and when. In case of doubt, however, it was always down to what Hitler had said.
On December the 13th, 1941, Soviet High Command announced that the fascist offensive against Moscow has now collapsed. Enemy attacking positions and defensive lines have been breached along the entire front.
I'm convinced that even if Moscow had fallen, the Soviets would have fought on. They would still have had sufficient resources, material resources through the industrial capacity, which had in many cases been re-established behind the Urals, but also resources in terms of manpower. In 1941, 97 new divisions were formed in the Far East alone. In other words, east of the Urals. So, Soviet fighting spirit and also the capacity to suffer would have remained unbroken.
Soviet propaganda showed pictures of towns and villages that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Wehrmacht had taken Kalinin, north of Moscow, on October 14, 1941. On December 16th, it was finally retaken by Soviet troops. Scattered German soldiers who had been cut off came out of their positions to be taken prisoner.
The offensive gains momentum all along the line. This town was held by the Nazis for 45 days. A handful of survivors come out of hiding. This is the meaning of the word deliverance. And this. I hid a bite of food from the Nazis. Take it, please. And this. Let me press your hand, and yours, and yours. And this. I have a grandson like you somewhere at the front. These are not dolls, but children. The vandals stripped them first. No accident. Slaughter of the innocent by official order. No isolated instance. Policy. Not hundreds of bodies like these, not thousands, but tens of thousands. No words, no statistics can sum up the brutality of a generation reared by Nazis. Mass torture, mass murder by order of the High Command.
The joy at being liberated went hand in hand with infinite pain and sadness. And the suffering of the civilian population would go on because the Germans had been ordered to follow a scorched earth policy as they retreated.
Through their love of their motherland, combined with their capacity for suffering, they would have fought on in the Great Patriotic War until they had achieved victory. Of that, I am absolutely sure. And the Wehrmacht would have had nothing to set against that, even in the long run. Compare that situation with Napoleon's in 1812. Moscow had been evacuated, so he set fire to it. Yet the Russians still fought on.
The early onset of winter had made the situation in besieged Stalingrad even worse. With the cold came hunger. The young, the weak, and the old received a daily ration of 3 thin slices of bread and a ridiculously small quantity of meat and fat. At first, the will of the people to stick together was still perceptible. They helped one another as best they could. But in December 1941, the people of Stalingrad fell into the funnel, as historian Sergei Yarov put it. Now corpses and coffins were part of everyday life.
The siege of Leningrad was an appalling course of action taken by the Wehrmacht. The city was certainly of military value, but laying siege to it was a crime, a horrific crime. When we consider that the Wehrmacht was not facing armed men, but as a rule the old, the young, women, the sick and the disabled, who were left to their own devices and forced to do terrible things, like resort to cannibalism. We are talking about a terrible crime.
By the end of 1941, the official number of deaths in Leningrad totaled 54,000. The dead were buried in mass graves. People only left their homes to go to work or to organize some food. That would have been easier had not Stalin himself prevented additional supplies being provided before the blockade. In the winter of 1941-42, Father Frost proved to be particularly unforgiving. At temperatures of 38 below, homes could no longer be heated. People stopped undressing and slept with everything they had. At night, their hair froze to their blankets. But for most of the Germans laying siege to Stalingrad, those dying in the city were only subhuman Slavs.
There are various scenarios that can't be implemented, but they are still in your head. And in this respect, Leningrad is different from Moscow, which the Germans couldn't quite reach. Yet Leningrad was where the Nazis wanted to see their policy realized. And it is thanks to the resistance of its citizens that this never happened. But the million or so lives that this resistance cost, we'll never know the exact number, shows how brutal this policy was, and in a certain context, how successful. It also shows how, irrespective of the terrors of the Bolshevist regime under which they lived, people were determined to drive out the invader.
The people of Leningrad were being buried alive, while outside the city, the Germans were calmly waiting for the catastrophe they had purposely created. In 1942, deaths in Leningrad in January, February and March alone totaled around 300,000. It was not until the spring of 1942 that the first relief supplies reached the city. The blockade only ended in January 1944. By then, the people of Leningrad had suffered and died over a period of 872 days.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni, auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern, vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
Operation Barbarossa had actually failed even before it was launched, because with the possibilities open to Germany's political and military leaders in 1941, in the absence of a clear strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union could never have been won.
It was the great conflict between two major ideologies of the time, fascism and communism. They clashed head-on with all the manpower and material the two sides could mobilize.
It was a war of conquest, a war of aggression in violation of international law, and a war of annihilation waged against the backdrop of National Socialist racial ideology.
People in the Soviet Union thought, the Nazi regime has begun a war of annihilation, so there is no question of me ever being ready to compromise, because that compromise will cost me my life.
Right from the start, it was an operation in which criminal behavior played a central role. The unusual, indeed specific characteristic of this operation is that law and morality were totally disregarded.
There wasn't really a plan, apart from, we're going to attack the Soviet Union and take Moscow, and ideally, by then we'll have won. That was so detached from reality.
They left too hastily to change the sign. Along the cold stretches of the road back, the retreating supermen left the marks of their bestiality.
Daybreak in Moscow, June the 13th, 1942. Soviet film director Mikhail Sluky had been commissioned to document a day in the great patriotic war against Nazi Germany. A camera team took these pictures in Moscow. All signs of fear and panic have vanished, because there is no longer any danger of the Soviet capital falling to the Wehrmacht.
If we believe the generals who wrote their memoirs after the Second World War, when the Wehrmacht was stopped outside Moscow and had thus failed to achieve its first major goal, taking the Soviet capital, virtually all of them realized that the war could no longer be won. Whether it had to be lost is a matter of dispute, but it could certainly no longer be won. The generals pointed out that, in the final analysis, they were having to fight a war the political leadership had forced on them.
Adolf Hitler had decided not to launch any further assault on Moscow. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht's armies had been re-equipped. Reinforcements had arrived, and munitions dumps were full in readiness for a major summer offensive, which, it was hoped, would see the Red Army finally defeated.
After the failure to take Moscow, which was actually the Wehrmacht's first major defeat, the summer offensive played a major role in boosting morale in the ranks of the Wehrmacht. On the other hand, if it was accepted that after Moscow the war was no longer winnable, why was no alternative to a summer offensive considered? Shouldn't his military leaders have gone to Hitler and said, "We have to stop the war because we can no longer win it"? But in a dictatorship like the Third Reich, that was almost inconceivable.
Hans Bastania was a cameraman with the propaganda ministry. He had been sent to Russia to take newsreel footage with 35mm color film. His material has survived and is an authentic document of the war. Bastania was a fervent supporter of Adolf Hitler and was convinced that the war would be won.
The Germans drew on the experience which had led them to believe they would be successful. And initially they were. But they were facing an adversary who had learnt, and who by now had brought up substantial reserves. Perhaps this had not been fully realized. What is more, we once again have that incredible Russian patriotism, that capacity for suffering, that and the declaration of a great patriotic war all came into play. With an indomitable Stalin behind them, and with the will to triumph at all costs, the people were ready not just to provide the necessary forces, but also to willingly accept whatever sacrifices had to be made.
One of the Wehrmacht's objectives was Sevastopol, a strategically important city at the southern tip of the Crimea. When the Germans laid siege to Sevastopol, it had around 100,000 defenders. The Soviet leadership had ordered them to fight to the last man.
Up to the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had tried to recover from the first month of the war by refreshing their units and obtaining new material. The plan of Germany's military leaders in the summer of 1942 consisted primarily of capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus, which were urgently needed for the war effort. By now, it was clear to everyone that this would no longer be a brief conflict. So, oil supplies would be a major requirement for being in a position to continue the war.
At the end of April, Hitler received his Italian ally Benito Mussolini to discuss plans for the offensive. The Duce too complied with Hitler's wishes.
Die Besprechungen zwischen den beiden Regierungschefs waren getragen von dem Geiste der engen Freundschaft und unlösbaren Waffenbrüderschaft der beiden Völker und ihrer Führer. Sie ergaben die völlige Übereinstimmung der Auffassungen über die durch die überwältigenden Siege der Dreierpaktmächte geschaffenen Lage und über die weitere Kriegführung der beiden Nationen auf politischem und militärischem Gebiet.
Hitler had intervened actively when his military leaders drew up the plans for the summer offensive. Amongst other things, this resulted in one offensive effectively turning into two offensives, but both had operational objectives which focused on the enemy's war economy and were designed to drastically weaken the Soviet Union. The first objective consisted of the oil fields in the Caucasus, while the second involved blocking the Volga as the Soviets' lifeline for supplies to Central Asia.
To make the operation a success for the Germans, the first necessity was control of the northern hub of the rail lines of the area and a new base of operations. That hub was a Volga River port we have come to know well, Stalingrad.
Hitler had ordered the Wehrmacht to reach Stalingrad, or at least to bombard it so heavily that it could no longer function as an important traffic and armaments hub. At this point in time, Hitler was not planning a total conquest of the city. His strategy was to surprise Stalin and once again force the Red Army on the defensive. The Nazi leadership gave its full support to the plan.
Hitler merkt im Grunde genommen, dass die Offensivkraft schon
Hitler had noticed that the Wehrmacht's offensive power was weakening. But instead of holding his troops together and concentrating them on one objective, he began to fan out his objectives more and more. He divided Army Group South into Army Groups A and B, with A heading for the Caucasus and B for Stalingrad. Another characteristic was that the gaps were having to be filled more and more with Allied troops, Hungarians, Romanians and Italians, and they constituted precisely the weak points which the Soviets would attack later.
Marshal Ion Antonescu on a visit to the front. Because of the huge losses the Wehrmacht had suffered in 1941, 500,000 Romanian troops were brought in as reinforcements. They were also involved in taking the Kerch Peninsula in the western Crimea. Operation Bastard Hunt, as it was known, was headed by Colonel General Erich von Manstein. In early July 1942, Manstein's forces finally took Sevastopol as well.
1942 ist es eben so, die Deutschen.
In 1942, the Germans wanted to retain the initiative. One alternative, of course, would have been a peace settlement. But Hitler didn't even consider such an option. He wanted to keep attacking and focused totally on the south. He knew that having access to oil was central to Germany continuing the war. And he also knew that without oil supplies, the Soviets could no longer wage a modern motorized war. So here too, we are talking about a decision that was not primarily military, but political.
Primär militärische Entscheidung, sondern eine ökonomische Entscheidung.
In the Ukraine on May the 12th, 1942, the Red Army launched a major offensive on a broad front. The aim, to retake Kharkov. Sitting in a German tank, Hans Bastania filmed battle scenes.
If you want to fight a longer war, you need supplies and, above all, strategic materials like oil. The German generals wanted to continue the war, so they agreed to aim for those supplies and to block the Volga, thus harming the enemy and creating possibilities for the Wehrmacht's own operations. And who knows, perhaps the German military also thought that the Soviets might even capitulate.
Somewhere in the Ukraine, Hans Bastania filmed German troops as heroic warriors, their sights set solely on victory. Pictures like these were designed to suggest to people back home that the Wehrmacht finally had everything under control again. But precisely the opposite was true.
I find it hard to see any strategy at all in Germany's conduct of the war in Eastern Europe. I believe that basically they only ever thought one step at a time. They had the chance to seriously damage the enemy by capturing important areas, and that is what they wanted to do. But I can't see any strategic thinking behind it.
Strategisches Denken kann man da, glaube ich, nicht dahinter erkennen.
Bastania's themes were war as a source of chivalry and camaraderie. But ultimately, both were subordinated to Hitler's crazy National Socialist ideology of a master race. Many German soldiers, too, were convinced that they had a natural right to dominate the world and shape it as they saw fit. Somewhere in the Ukraine, Bastania filmed this symbolic scene of Soviet prisoners of war doing the dirty work. Right from the start, Operation Barbarossa was never a clean war. What these pictures don't show is that German brutality towards the Soviet civilian population had not abated, because the inhuman objective was still the same: to enslave the Slavic race or exterminate it.
Basically, to a certain extent, the brutalization of German troops had already been approved through the Barbarossa decree, even though certain boundaries were set, like discipline within the ranks. So at the back of their minds, the military must have thought that, in what they were doing and permitting, they were getting close to a tipping point at which soldiers would become brutalized. I would not like to speculate on whether this was actually observed.
German barbarity did not fail to have an impact.
Most of the men had gone to war, leaving behind a civilian population consisting of women, children, and the elderly. And they saw the masses of corpses left behind as the Wehrmacht advanced. Whole villages went up in flames. People were herded into churches, which were then torched. As a consequence of such crimes, the few remaining men withdrew from their villages and went into the forests. Partisan resistance is a major element in the history of White Russia, for instance.
In the Soviet documentary, A Day in the War, by Mikhail Sluky, the partisan war was glorified as a heroic defensive struggle to prevent the invaders committing further crimes. But in reality, the partisan war was a bloody conflict that claimed countless lives. The true heroes in this fight were the women.
The partisans in the forests somehow had to get hold of food supplies. This meant having contacts in the towns. Most towns were in German hands, but the Germans did not see women as a threat, especially women with children. And women who had joined the partisans used to go into town with their offspring and get hold of medicines, as well as spare parts for weapons, and indeed weapons themselves, and take them back to the camps. So the partisan war was an important conflict. It was a massive problem for the Germans because they could not get it under control.
In the meantime, the partisans had also officially become an important reinforcement in the Great Patriotic War, and after some initial hesitation, Stalin even allowed women to serve in an active role in the Red Army.
Girls who were 16, 17, or 18 years old had already grown up in the Soviet system with its ideology, its collectives, and its joint responsibility. They had been shaped by the purges of the 1930s, when the communist concept of the Soviet Union was propagated on a grand scale. So what was retrieved, if you like, was precisely what had been programmed in earlier. It was the same with Soviet men. The same pathos was addressed irrespective of gender.
Women played a different role under Soviet communism than they played in the bourgeois West. Officially, they were on an equal footing with men, but the party and the military were still male-dominated domains.
Stalin's idea, and that of the Soviet regime, was to get women into the factories so that the men could be released and sent to the front. But the women interpreted this as their own personal decision. The same patriotic sense of responsibility awoke in them as in Soviet young men, and hundreds of thousands of them flocked to the defense committees.
Soviet propaganda soon made use of the impact of scenes like this. But the Wehrmacht remained an out-and-out man's world. Close to the front or in occupied towns, women could only be deployed as nurses or secretaries. The fighting was done solely by soldiers. June 28, 1942, saw the opening phase of the Great Summer Offensive, Operation Blue.
The Wehrmacht was still an exceptionally powerful and also highly successful adversary. In preparation for Operation Blue, several encirclement battles had taken place in which the Wehrmacht, at least in early summer, had shown that it was still the master of the battlefield. And at first this southerly offensive, too, proved highly successful. However, the Red Army had learned to pull its troops back. So the big encirclement battles of the summer and autumn of 1941, when the Germans took hundreds of thousands of prisoners, no longer occurred.
Hans Bastania took these pictures in occupied Kharkov. They show a deceptive calm. Since the spring of 1942, the Ukraine's second biggest city had been fiercely contested. After the battle for Moscow, the Red Army stubbornly tried to register another major victory. Most of Kharkov's inhabitants hoped that they would at least be rid of the hated invader. But there were also many Ukrainians who cooperated with the Germans.
The Soviet population was in a bad way. In the end, it was only the will to survive that kept people going, and to some, nothing mattered anymore. They just wanted to stay alive, or perhaps protect their children by not only failing to oppose the German invaders, but perhaps by even helping them. But Stalin made no distinctions. All collaborators, he said, would be put to death.
As a deterrent, Soviet propaganda publicized scenes like this. The Red Army planned to eliminate the Wehrmacht's 6th Army in a pincer operation, but the Germans were able to turn the tide and encircle large numbers of the enemy. In a classic battle of annihilation, Hitler's tanks achieved one of their last great victories.
Kharkov was still a limited offensive, and the Germans were hugely successful. That was also in the spring of 1942, when its troops were still buoyant and the Wehrmacht showed all its ability. Stalingrad was still far off, especially the boundless expanse of the steppes which surround the city. This territory was so huge that even the Germans and their allies stood absolutely no chance of securing it. And there was not only this expanse, to the south of it lay the Caucasus.
Thanks to the speed of the German tanks and assault guns, 240,000 Soviet troops were taken prisoner. In front of the German positions, the bodies piled up. According to recent research, the Red Army's casualties, dead, missing and wounded, came to 277,000. In addition, 652 tanks and 1,646 guns were destroyed. This second battle for Kharkov was a serious blow to the morale of the Red Army. The Germans were exultant. Now, even those generals who had been skeptical marveled at Hitler's perseverance strategy. But Operation Blue was marked by German arrogance, which soon would have dire consequences.
Since June 1942, the Soviets had had a rough idea of the Wehrmacht's plans, but basic information on the Germans' next thrust literally fell into their hands when a fighterless Storch, carrying a member of the German General Staff, was shot down over Soviet-held territory. The officer had with him a briefcase containing top-secret military documents on the forthcoming offensive. The Russians reacted very flexibly to the information, retreating into the vast expanses behind them. Basically, it was exactly what Kutuzov had done with Napoleon in 1812. And they waited until the German front was so overstretched that it was relatively easy to penetrate.
For his documentary, A Day in the War, on June the 13th, 1942, director Mikhail Sluky deployed 160 cameramen at various sections of the front. Their footage was designed to demonstrate the Red Army's unbending resistance. To create the appropriate effect, some scenes were staged. War as a work of art, not as reflection of reality. At this point in time, 3 Air Force regiments, consisting solely of women, became famous.
Soviet women gained notoriety as pilots because they were so daring. German propaganda described them as the witches of the night. So as not to be discovered, they would switch off their engines and lights and fly so low that German machine gun fire would have brought them down with ease. They were so notorious because they came from nowhere.
When A Day in the War appeared in Russian cinemas at the end of 1942, one of Sluky's colleagues criticized the extremely aesthetic portrayal of an imaginary war. The Germans should not be shown as easy adversaries, he said, but as the most powerful enemies the world has ever seen. Since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans had lost 350,000 men, killed or missing in action.
From a purely professional point of view, German military leaders should have said that, in their opinion, the war no longer seemed winnable. They didn't, and so all further decisions taken in this war against the Soviet Union simply amounted to, we are going ahead with the war because we don't have an alternative. Operational solutions were sought and found and implemented, but basically, at least as far as I can see, the war was continued without any recognizable operational or strategic objective that would still have been sufficient to achieve victory or would at least have resulted in some kind of stalemate.
Case Blue had been in operation since June 28, 1942. The first objective was the city of Voronezh on the River Don. Only now that Stalin realized that the Wehrmacht was not advancing on Moscow, so he ordered Voronezh to be held at all costs. Arrival at the Führer headquarters of German armaments industrialists Hermann Röchling, Alfred Krupp, and their colleagues. They had been invited by the new armaments minister Albert Speer to finally solve the Wehrmacht supply problems. Speer demanded an immediate increase in output, and the industrial leaders promised to reorganize the production of weapons and ammunition. But it was all too late.
The situation in autumn 1942 was such that anyone with any kind of military experience who looked at the map would realize at once that it was actually untenable, that it was only a matter of time before this overstretched front, which was virtually unoccupied, collapsed. Naturally, Halder also saw this, and in his diary he wrote that the situation was gradually becoming grotesque. Nowadays, it is believed that he provoked the dispute leading to his dismissal so that he would no longer have to bear responsibility for what was happening.
On July 23, 1942, the chief of the General Staff noted, "This so-called leadership is characterized by a pathological reacting to the impressions of the moment and a total lack of any understanding of the command machinery and its possibilities."
In the course of the war, the Red Army's military leaders learnt comparatively quickly how to conduct their own operations and, above all, how to counter the enemy's operations. But that took time. It really only came to bear at Stalingrad and afterwards. In late 42 and early 43, it became clear that not only were Soviet troops better equipped than they had been in the first year of the war, and that their supply system ensured they were being better and better equipped, but that in the meantime they had also gained experience in waging war. Soviet commanders had been fighting the Germans for more than a year and were coping better and better with the war.
According to Franz Halder, the tendency to underestimate the enemy's potential has always been present, but it is gradually assuming grotesque proportions and constitutes a danger. The situation is becoming increasingly intolerable. Serious work is now no longer possible. The Red Army was proving dogged and relentless. Nonetheless, time and again, Soviet troops panicked. In an order to hold out, Stalin said that anyone who retreated would be shot. The Soviet Secret Service used violence to ensure that discipline was maintained. Naturally, the propaganda machine showed heroic faces, including those of women.
In their first serious situation in action, women stood the test, and they were often more courageous than the men. In one story, a unit was under fire for several hours. One of the men lay wounded out in no man's land and couldn't be helped. It's soul-destroying having to watch someone slowly bleeding to death and being unable to do anything about it. But there was this one woman who inched her way forward on her stomach over 3 hours while constantly under fire. She brought back her comrade, who was 3 times her size, even though her commander had forbidden her to do it.
The Red Army had fewer and fewer supply problems because by now, tanks were also arriving from the United States. Hitler had ignored all the warnings from his generals and had German armies advance south at high speed. At first, this strategy proved highly successful. Hans Bastania recorded events on color film.
Das deutsche Vorgehen ist
Basically, the German approach was still the same. The Wehrmacht was even more motorized and enjoyed success. The problem was that the Soviets were now reacting a lot more flexibly. And that is actually the point at which German thrusts often came to nothing. The Wehrmacht's diminishing successes showed that its strength was basically spent. On the other hand, it speaks volumes for the discipline of its soldiers, who kept going, even though they noticed that they were enjoying less and less success.
Hitler had realized that there was an opportunity to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus. He said to his generals, "If we don't take Maikop and Grozny, I will have to end the war." Stalin knew that the Red Army didn't have enough troops in the Caucasus, so he sent the head of his secret service to put the fear of the devil in them.
Red Army leaders were under double pressure. Obviously, there was the military foe, the German aggressors and their allies, but then there was also Stalin himself. He had already taken drastic measures in response to initial defeats at the start of the war. He'd had army commanders sacked, arrested and shot. Consequently, the lives of Soviet military commanders were also always at risk from within their own ranks, so to speak. And where Stalingrad was concerned, for Stalin there was also the psychological importance of the city named after him not falling into German hands. Anyone who holds Stalingrad can blockade the Volga. The river was one of the Soviet Union's supply routes, which basically ran from a Persian corridor to Central Asia. So Stalingrad was clearly a military operational objective.
As an armaments and traffic hub, Stalingrad was only supposed to be neutralized, but Hitler then ordered the Sixth Army to take the city at all costs.
Further north, the Nazi pincers were within 15 miles of Stalingrad. This city had become the focal point of the whole campaign. Regardless of the cost, Stalingrad must be captured. Those were the German orders.
A few months previously, Friedrich Paulos had been appointed commander-in-chief of the Sixth Army. The general who had helped to plan Operation Barbarossa warned Hitler that a force of 300,000 men would not be enough to take the city.
Stalingrad war ein Prestigeobjekt.
Stalingrad was a prestige object, not only for the Soviets, but also for the Germans. At a party celebration in November 1942, Hitler had boasted Stalingrad was as good as captured. For his part, Stalin knew that if the city bearing his name fell, it would mean a massive loss of prestige. So in July 1942, The notorious Stalin order of not one step back was issued. Applying draconian measures, the Soviets then tried to stop any attempt to flee from Stalingrad, to prevent any retreat, no matter how sensible.
When the first German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad on September the 7th, 1942, many Red Army units panicked. But Stalin's threats had the desired effect. The Soviet defenders dug foxholes and took up positions in buildings which, in good time, had been turned into fortresses.
The Germans never had control of the city. They had become involved in bitter house-to-house fighting. It was no longer clear where the front line was or where communication lines between the various positions ran. Both sides used snipers. Losses were high. Most of the city lay in ruins. The combatants fought from cellars. The military situation was confusing. There were no clear boundaries. If the Sixth Army was to be saved, it was then at the latest that German troops should have been pulled out of the city.
Wenn man Truppe hätte retten wollen, aus der Stadt heraus hätte gehen müssen.
On the other hand, there were still hopes of reinforcements arriving. But, like the replacement units that had been expected, they never appeared.
For a while, the Red Army was able to ferry men, weapons and supplies across the Volga and into the city. The Germans were unable to capture the landing stages in the town center. Then the Russian encirclement of Stalingrad was completed, and German officers told their men that the war on Eastern Front would soon be over.
There were many executions, some of which were carried out personally by the commander-in-chief. That really was a sign to every Soviet soldier that not a single centimetre of ground was to be yielded. On reflection, however, it paid off. It was the prerequisite for the success of Operation Uranus in November 1942, when the Red Army succeeded in encircling the Sixth Army.
When the Red Army launched a counter-offensive on November 19, 1942, Stalingrad was almost completely in the hands of the Wehrmacht. Operation Uranus was a bold maneuver. The idea was to encircle the Sixth Army within the space of a few days.
Two simultaneous attacks were launched, one from the north, one from the south. The German armies encircling Stalingrad were now themselves threatened with encirclement. Finally, the two prongs met. These battle-hardened soldiers of the Northern Army and soldiers of the Southern were emotional as children as they greeted each other. They knew this meeting meant the salvation of Stalingrad and of their country.
Hitler's risky venture had failed. More than 330,000 men were caught like rats in a trap. In the city, the house-to-house fighting continued with unremitting ferocity. Now, it was the Germans who were being urged to hold out and fight to the last bullet.
Camaraderie is one of the pillars of every army, of course, along with motivation and solidarity. And in extreme situations, camaraderie is extremely important. We know from wounded soldiers who were flown out of Stalingrad that they left with mixed feelings. They felt guilty at leaving their colleagues in the lurch. So camaraderie is particularly prominent in life or death situations. When life itself is at stake, it's a massive pillar of solidarity.
Ein ganz großer Pfeiler für den Zusammenhalt.
Frontline experience is definitely something that welds people together. And when you go through an extreme situation with someone, psychologically, it has a bonding effect.
On November the 24th, 1942, Hitler decided that the troops encircled at Stalingrad would be supplied from the air. Because of the bitter cold and the shortage of food, there was a danger of the men starving or freezing to death. In view of the poor supply situation for his troops, General Paulus wanted to attempt a breakout, but Hitler wouldn't hear of it.
Where planning a war against the Soviet Union was concerned, Paulus was the classic technocrat. He implemented what he was ordered to, so he tried to devise the best possible plan that would work militarily. With regard to Stalingrad, he had a clear order, which he implemented as he had been told to. He had certain doubts as to whether everything would work out the way he imagined, but not even the Führer's orders, and in the end, not even promotion to Field Marshal, were sufficient for him to remain loyal to Hitler and hold the city, come what may.
Because the air bridge failed, the lack of food, fuel, ammunition, and heating and medical material was so serious that the Sixth Army became practically immobile. Shortly before Christmas, Paulus hoped that help would soon come from outside.
Friedrich Paulus had certain character traits which, in the crucial situation in the winter of 1942-1943, proved calamitous. He was an extremely elitist figure, but in the final analysis, he was also a weak person. Someone who was used to living in a world of staff officers, where he didn't have to confront reality so much. Naturally, he should have offered to surrender, not only to put an end to the fighting, but also because then the hatred potential of the Soviets would have been far less. After all, they had had to fight in the ruins for weeks on end, so their readiness to treat German prisoners badly rose from day to day.
In early January 1943, the Führer received Romanian leader Ion Antonescu at his headquarters. Hitler made the Romanians mainly responsible for the precarious situation the Sixth Army was in. Antonescu countered by criticizing the Wehrmacht and its commanders for their errors of judgment.
In 1940, Hitler was feted as the greatest commander of all time because he had taken certain decisions, or because people thought he had. Later, too, he intervened time and again in the conduct of the war, but whatever catastrophic influence he might have had can only be determined here and there. Take Stalingrad, for instance, where retreat was called for instead of what Hitler wanted. The Führer insisted, and the generals lacked the courage to say, "What you are doing is crazy. It is only costing lives."
At 7:35 on January 31st, 1943, the German radio station in Stalingrad broadcast the following message: "Capture by Russians imminent. We are preparing to destroy everything."
This was Kyle and Kessel with a vengeance, but the Nazis were getting Kesseled instead of the Russians. And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, the last shot was fired. Peace came to Stalingrad. In the shattered streets, the blasted ruins, the ghastly evidence of their ordeal, the defenders of the city greet the rescuing army of the dawn. Stalingrad is free. The Nazis had capitulated.
Friedrich Paulus surrendered. A few days previously, Hitler had promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal, expecting that he would commit suicide.
I regard Paulus as a good example of an opportunist commander who now and again follows orders he knows will not be effective instead of firmly demanding that they be changed. This proved tragic for the troops under his command, especially at Stalingrad. Even there, he was not prepared to personally accept the consequences. He expected his soldiers to fight to the bitter end while he was surrendering.
On February 3rd, Greater German Radio broadcast a special report. Under the outstanding command of Field Marshal Paulus, it said, the Sixth Army fought to the last man, finally succumbing to overwhelming odds and unfavorable conditions.
Symbolically, it was an incredibly important victory for the Red Army and a massive spur to the motivation of its soldiers. Stalingrad gave the Red Army hope, indeed the certainty, that the Germans could be beaten and driven out of the Soviet Union. For the Germans, Stalingrad was a major defeat and was perhaps seen as the psychological turning point of the war. However, the start of the Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow was actually the beginning of the end for Hitler.
A total of 91,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity at Stalingrad. Against his better judgment, propaganda minister Goebbels had the news spread that no one had survived.
At Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht lost an entire army for the first time. As we know, on the home front, the news came as a massive shock. In that respect, it certainly was a psychological turning point for the Germans. But above all, it was a psychological turning point for people in the Soviet Union who saw that the Red Army, their army, could stop the enemy and inflict a decisive defeat. And something which tends to be overlooked, on a political level, it was a warning, especially for London and Washington. They suddenly had to plan for something they hadn't expected before, that the Red Army could well be in a position to defeat the Wehrmacht on its own, and thus bring down the German Reich in Europe.
Operation Barbarossa was intended to show the world the superiority of the German master race, but Hitler and his soldiers only succeeded in underlining their desire to destroy and the criminal nature of the National Socialist regime.